Yes, I'd like to welcome all of you to my podcast today. The podcast, of course, is The Courage to Be Courageous, and I'm Dan Bolen, your host. This is a place where all can come to hear people across all parts of the United States who face fear in their life, maybe even had hidden secrets, and yet they've been able to walk through the fear and have the courage to be courageous. And I'm so pleased to have with us this morning who's become actually a personal friend. He's my co-author, Landon Napoleon. And I'd like to welcome you, Landon, to our podcast this morning.
Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be here.
It's going to be an interesting story how Landon and I actually got connected together and how we were able to write this book. Now, I'll start part of the process here. When I came out as a gay man and had lost my entire family, I decided to write a book for cathartic reasons. How that started is I had a counselor named Chris, and he said, Dan, you have such an incredible story. Have you ever thought about doing a book, writing a memoir? And I said, well, I would think about it. Then after I thought, well, it would be good for me to be able, for cathartic reasons, to be able to tell my story for myself, since I couldn't share it with any of my family because they will not have anything to do with me. So I wanted to write this story about the authentic Dan, and that's how it started. My counselor, Chris, said there's a gentleman that I know named Landon Napoleon who was a writer, a professional writer, and I'll put you in contact with him. So I contacted Landon, and Landon probably remembers the first thing I asked him was, are you okay if I'm gay? Do you remember that?
Of course, yes.
And then when I told him a little bit about my story, he said, I'm the one that should write this story. And so in the process, because I was still being a little tentative about it, he suggested that I contact a gentleman by the name of Jeff Batten, and he had written a book with Jeff called it Grinning Like a Jackass Eating Briars. And you'll kind of have to find the book to read the book to understand what all that means. So after I contacted Jeff and read the book, I was so impressed with the way Jeff's story went. And by the way, we're going to have Jeff Batten in the future on our podcast as well. That I then hired Landon to be able to write my story. Now, I had no intentions of going public. In fact, Landon can make some comments about, I said, I'll do it, but it's only for me, and I don't want anyone else to read it, other than I will send it to my family. They can burn it, they can throw it away, whatever they want to do with it. However, that's the only thing I wanted to do with it. So, Landon, so tell me how it came to be that we were able to get together and how we were able to get this book out to the public, because at the time I had no intentions of doing that.
Yes, you were my first ever client who contacted me to write a book, but then also simultaneously said, I don't know that I want a book, and I certainly don't want the story to be made public. So I thought from the outset it was an interesting challenge. And I could also tell from that first call that you were pretty nervous about asking me the big question, which was, are you okay? I'm a gay man. Are you okay if I'm a gay man? And I think my response was actually, of course I'm okay. And I might even prefer it. Do you remember me saying that?
I do. I remember you saying that.
I myself am straight, and interestingly, your book and then Jeff Batten's book, the last two books or client memoirs that I've done have been about, two coming out stories. So I thought it was interesting that you were contacting me to do a book, but yet you weren't quite certain that you actually wanted a book. I think your original intent was really to be able to put something together that you could share with your family because you'd been disfellowshipped from the church. That was really your only way to reach them.
That is totally correct. And also, as I mentioned earlier, for my own cathartic, my own healing process as well.
Right.
So Landon and I went through, counting all the contacts and back and forth and all that, about 1.5 years total. And it was an incredible story. Landon and I, at times, would spend hours a day together, me crying and laughing and bearing my soul to a book that I was totally vulnerable with. And Landon made an interesting comment to me yesterday. Because I thought it would not go public, you said you thought I was even more vulnerable and more raw. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I think as we began the creative process in your mind, you were doing this primarily for your own cathartic reasons, a secondary benefit, share it with your family. But beyond that, you weren't concerned about really anyone else seeing it or what they might think about you or how people might react. So I think from the outset, you were completely open, honest, and transparent in a really deep, fundamental way. Nothing was off limits. You shared every detail. And that was right from the outset with our creative process.
Mm-hmm. I certainly did. I laid it all out there, as vulnerable as I've ever been in my whole life, with the idea nobody except my family would see it. So the process continued on, and we've got to spend a lot of time together. Landon came out and spent a week with me in my condo in La Jolla, California, where we were able to do some, he was able to do his creative writing. I was able to tell my story. And I began to feel like I was finding not only an author, but a true friend in my life. And Landon, I can honestly say, is a true friend of mine. And I think the book kind of hits on it possibly. Something magical began to happen. Do you remember exactly what that was and the reason I decided to go public?
Yeah, so first of all, writing a book is hard work. There's no question. It takes a lot of time. It takes collaboration, thinking about the story. Where do we start the story? All these different questions. And as we went through the process, I think there really was a transformation that I saw in you, which was what started as a way for you to sort of process everything that had happened in your life. I think took on kind of a different mission, a larger mission, which was your transformation could really help others. And so I think you went, and I'm not exactly sure when in our process this happened, but I think you went from thinking this is something I'm only doing for myself and don't ever want the world to see, to being my story can help others. I want to share my story, even beyond the finished product that we would end up with. You sort of took on this new mission, I think.
I think that's totally true. And I think when we were working on the book and And I think Landon had brought out to me several times, this is a powerful story. This will help others. And he kind of nudged me in the direction of going public with it. Of course, it was totally my choice. But I had a powerful story, and he told me I had one. And of course, Landon is a professional writer. I believe he's written 19 books, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so I thought, you know what? I was in the people business as an executive recruiter. I love helping people and help them get their careers. Now, I thought I can help them with their life. And it was so inspiring from what the comments I've received from my book to find how deeply other people are struggling with fear and how they need to have the courage to get through the fear and come out. And that's why I decided to go public. And that's when Landon and I went public with the book and put it on Amazon. Of course, it can be ordered on Amazon. And I would make a comment, too, that all the proceeds from my book do not go to me. I mean, the profit that I make on my books is going to three LBGT organizations. I'm not keeping the profits for myself. I don't need the money, so I'm sending them to 3 organizations. So whenever you're sharing a story, my story, through my book, you're helping 3 LGBTQ organizations, and I want to make that clear for everyone that buys my book. So it's interesting, too, because as we began to write the book and we were able to express our feelings, I think a friendship developed, a true friendship. And I think there was one thing that you and I shared yesterday, Landon, about how in some ways you thought I was a mentor. What did you mean by that?
Well, let's be clear. You are a little older than I am.
A couple years anyway, yes.
Couple years. As far as being a mentor, I really admire the success that you found in the business world, running your own company. And that was something that I definitely would like to emulate. It's also intricately woven with your story, the story of your business and your success. And as we learned in our process, and readers will learn in the book, there was kind of a dark side to that, to your financial success as well. But as a sometimes poor, struggling artist and writer at different times in my life, your monetary success was something that I wanted for myself. And you and I shared a really deep conversation at one point in our process where I shared that with you. And I'll never forget what you told me, which was that you asked me how old I was, and you then said that you would trade everything you had accumulated materially for what I had at that point in my life in terms of my own family, the relationship I have with my wife, my 2 daughters. And that was very profound for me. It put into real sharp perspective, what's important. And maybe on some level, I had looked beyond what I actually had, which was even more important than what I thought I wanted, which was what you had. And so that was a really powerful exchange we had. And, we both shared some tears during that exchange. And it was a real aha moment for me, and something that stayed with me ever since.
It was a great
And
experience for
so,
me as well. And I think that's one of the things I think that brought us so close together is we were both totally vulnerable with each other. And
right.
and I think that's when the deeper friendship really started to involve, was with that type of thing. I want to talk about the book overall, Landon, and Landon has done an incredible job of writing the book. He has a master's degree in creative writing from Scotland, I believe. And but overall, for those who have not read the book, and for those that are struggling with some fear in their life and they're trying to find courage to get through that, how would you summarize the book and how it could help them? Whether they're male or female, whether they're straight or heterosexual, I think it affects all. What's your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I think we're all human beings, gay, straight, somewhere in between. And as human beings, we all have struggles. We have parts of ourselves we don't like. We have things to overcome. And that's where I think there's a common thread in your book, which is, first of all, figuring out and accepting who you really are, whatever that means, what you really want in your life, and then having the courage to then go live that life. And I think that's a message that any human being on some level will relate to.
Thank you, Landon. I totally agree and accept that as well. And I think also for me to add to what Landon said, in order for you to get true peace, you have to be your authentic self. Because if you're not authentic with yourself, you're not going to get true peace and true happiness. That's kind of a lesson that I figured out by my book. And I want to talk something too, because Landon was not always a writer. And there was a time in his life he had to have courage to be courageous to get through that. I believe, tell us the story when you were at Motorola.
I graduated from college. My undergraduate degree is in journalism. And I had at the time what would be considered a really plum gig. I worked in the public relations department at Motorola. Sure. But I just absolutely knew in my heart that that's not how I wanted to spend my life. What I really wanted to do, and what I'd always wanted to do, was to be an author. So I very naively and boldly, yes, a lot of courage in there, quit my job and hung out my shingle as an author. And that was more than 30 years ago.
And what's interesting about this story, Landon's boss, I know personally, his name is Lawrence. And when I've talked to Lawrence, because we share a happy hour together, he was telling me that he tried to talk you out of becoming an author. You've got a good job.
Yeah,
you're doing a great thing here. He said, I did everything I could to talk him out of being an author. Is that how you recall it?
Yes. And Lawrence to this day is also a good friend of mine. And yeah, I think he, well-intentioned, I think he was probably right on a lot of levels, that what I was proposing sounded a little crazy. But in hindsight, absolutely, it really was just following my heart and soul and doing what I know I wanted to do and pretty much putting everything else aside.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've really enjoyed this conversation with Landon. As I mentioned before, he's become a true friend of mine. As I mentioned, he's written 19 books. One of his books actually became a Hollywood movie called Zigzag. And so he's obviously had some success himself as an author. But I believe, I think you have true peace and happiness right now, don't you, Landon?
Yes. I think as much as any, I don't think we're ever quite done as human beings. I think there's always new things to conquer. But I think, yes, fundamentally, as kind of my baseline when I wake up every day, I like who I see in the mirror. I love what I do. I have an amazing family. I have all the big things right and in place. And that really all started all those years ago with being true to myself and doing what you suggest people do in your book, which is finding the courage to be courageous.
That is a good plug. It is a good plug. Well, we've certainly appreciated having Landon as my guest today on my podcast, The Courage to Be Courageous. If you get the opportunity to check some of his books out, I think you'll find them to be interesting. There's also some that are fiction and some that are obviously memoirs. So we look forward to hopefully having you enjoy some of them, the messages in his books as well, too. So Landon, thank you so much for being my guest on The Courage to Be Courageous. And until next time, stay safe and stay healthy.